Louisiana Purchase, and all remaining western states will be in Division 4. The 4 main divisions will have 24 senators each, divided up amongst the component states in this arbitrary fashion. Texas, however, will get 6 senators, because that seems like the kind of thing that could have happened for some reason, while Hawaii will have 2 and Alaska will have 1. So 105 senators in all, just like in Canada. Hopefully this system strikes you as horribly offensive and unfair to modern sensibilities, because that is certainly how it works in Canada. The next thing is that American senators would no longer be elected under this system, but rather appointed directly by the American president, or rather, American prime minister. They would be forced to retire at age 75, at which point their seats would become eligible for a new appointment. There's really no way of knowing what the partisan consequences of this would be. The number of Republicans or Democrats in this sort of Senate, circa 2021, would be the product of all sorts of unknowable variables, like how many senators were appointed by which previous president over the last few decades and how old they all were and so on. What we do know, however, is that the arbitrary nature of the US Senate under this system would no doubt make the Senate so controversial and hated that it would probably evolve into a mostly ceremonial rubber stamp sort of thing, because the public wouldn't tolerate it being anything else. This is very much what happened in Canada. And the closest US precedent would probably be the Electoral College. In short, adopting the Canadian political system would see America swapping out its current Senate, which is very powerful and important, for a figurehead institution that would probably not wind up doing much of anything. All right, now let's give the US Senate to Canada. The US Senate is much conceptually simpler than the Canadian one. 2 elected senators for each state. So in Canada's case, that would mean 2 senators for every province. This would make for a rather small Senate of just 20 people, since Canada only has 10 provinces. But what about the Northern Territories? Should they get senators too? Canada's 3 Northern Territories are a good example of a unique Canadian thing that doesn't really have an equivalent in the US political system. For all intents and purposes, the territories are exactly the same as provinces, with the same political systems and responsibilities. But because their populations are so small, less than 50,000 people each, they're also arbitrarily excluded from some aspects of the Canadian federal system on the basis that, they're just territories. They don't play a role in passing constitutional amendments, for instance, but they do have voting representatives in the Canadian Parliament, including senators. So despite having a similar title, they're not really analogous to US territories like Puerto Rico or Guam, which do not have full representation in Congress. So it's hard to know how they would be treated in some theoretical US system. But let's just say that they get a single senator to represent all 3. That seems like the sort of compromise that someone might have come up with. Now, having an equal elected Senate in Canada would almost certainly change Canadian politics in many substantial ways. Not only would it give the Senate a mandate to actually do stuff rather than just rubber stamp, it would also allow Canada's smaller provinces to play a much larger role in the legislative process than they do now, and help offset the power of the 2 most populated provinces, Ontario and Quebec. But as in America, this would also be controversial because you'd have a tiny province like Prince Edward Island with exactly the same amount of Senate clout as a province 10 times its size. I'm not really sure what Canadian political party would benefit the most from this setup. In the US, states usually elect senators from the same party as their governor, but not always. And of course, many states will elect senators from 2 different parties. My sense is that the Canadian Liberals would probably do well, since an equal representation Senate would overrepresent the parts of Canada where Liberals tend to do best, like the Maritimes, while underrepresenting Western Canada, where Conservatives do best. But it would probably be somewhat close. Here is an arbitrary Senate projection I came up with, just based on my own sense of Canadian politics. 11 Liberals, 8 Conservatives, and 2 other. All right, and now for the 2 houses. The House of Commons and the House of Representatives. These are the 2 most active lawmaking chambers of both countries, so as far as what they do, swapping them out wouldn't change much. And structurally, things wouldn't change much either. Both Canada and the United States honor the principle of representation by population when it comes to their houses, which means that the bigger states or provinces get more seats. In Canada, the official number is 1 seat for every 111,166 people in each province. That provides a decent-sized parliament for Canada, a country of about 37 million people. However, if we applied this formula to America, a country of 330 million people, we would get an insanely gigantic parliament with like 3,000 seats. So let's just scale up Canada's magic number by a factor of 10 and say that the Americans get 1 member of parliament per 1 million people in order to get an outcome closer in size to Canada's current House of 338. Based on my number crunching, using this formula, America's parliamentary seat count would look something like this, and the House would have exactly 330 members. This is smaller than the current US House of Representatives, and many states would see their representation in Washington decline. But the general ratio of representation by population would be more or less the same to what America has now, and as a result, the partisan composition of the House would probably be roughly similar as well. Now, Canada also has a rule that says no province can have fewer House members than it has senators, but applying this rule in this case doesn't actually give a boost in representation to any state, because most states in this system don't have very many senators to begin with. Now, in America, meanwhile, the size of their House is fixed by law at 435 members. According to the Pew Research Center, this amounts to 1 member per 747,000 Americans. And once again, the population disparities between Canada and the US cause some problems here. Assuming we don't want Canada to have a Congress of just 50 people, let's scale this number down by a factor of 10. So 1 Canadian congressman for every 75,000 people. And doing the math, we come up with a Canadian Congress that looks like this, with a total of 435 seats. And once again, it's not really that different from what exists now. The maritime provinces are a bit worse off because they no longer get the boost of the Senate top-off rule under this system, but overall it's broadly similar to the status quo. It's fair to assume that this House would have similar partisan standings to the current Canadian House, which is to say a liberal plurality with a strong conservative second place and a big caucus of nationalists from Quebec. One of the reasons why we can make this sort of assumption is that Canada and the US use the same electoral system, so there's no reason to suspect that the party system or the sort of people who win elections would be affected by any of this. But anyway, the biggest difference that would come to Canada from adopting the American system would be that the House would no longer pick the leader of Canada, since Canada would no longer have a prime ministerial system. Over in our new American Parliament, the leader of the United States would be Prime Minister Nancy Pelosi, since she is the current leader of the biggest political party in the House, and that is how the head of the government is chosen in Canada. Prime Minister Pelosi would enjoy a lot of power over the federal government in this alternative universe, since the Prime Minister is very powerful in the Canadian system. She would not only get to fill any vacant Senate seats, she could unilaterally appoint any judge she wanted to the Supreme Court as well. In the Canadian system, the Senate doesn't have to advise and consent to executive appointments. So basically, Nancy could fill all of the big government agencies with whoever she wanted. There would be no problem getting Neera Tanden a job, no matter what Joe Manchin thought. Pelosi would, however, have to appoint fellow members of the legislature to head all of the executive departments. So like the Secretary of State would also have to be a sitting member of the House and so on. I suspect these would be the politicians who are currently heading the House committees in the real world US system. In America, being a committee chair is about as high as you can rise in the legislature. But in Canada, being a committee chair is much less prestigious because the real top job is getting into cabinet. Prime Minister Pelosi would also have the power to decide when House elections would be, since the PM controls the election schedule as well. Basically, she would be the mightiest person in Washington with very few checks on her power. Now, how would the leader of Canada be chosen if Canada adopted the US system by contrast? Well, we would have to use the American Electoral College system, which means more math. So the Electoral College gives every state a set number of votes based on their combined total of senators and representatives. So using our previous numbers, Canada's Electoral College map would look like this. And who would have been elected President of Canada in the last election under this system? Well, the Electoral College is winner take all, so whoever wins the plurality of the vote in a place gets all of the electoral votes. So let's see how this would look if we plug in all of the provincial popular vote totals of the last Canadian election. So yes, pretty solid landslide for Justin Trudeau. Of course, as President of Canada, Trudeau would not be nearly as powerful as he currently is as Prime Minister, since he would have to share authority with a House and Senate elected separately from him, and whose support he could not necessarily take for granted. Trudeau's cabinet picks and judges would have to be approved by that closely divided Senate, for instance, and he'd have to finagle a lot more with the House as well in order to get his